A great civilization is not conquered from without until it has destroyed itself within. Quote by Will Durant. The Indian Act has had negative consequences for Indigenous peoples in Canada since 1876. Here are 10 of the worst aspects of them, or should we say 10 ways to destroy a civilization. 1. Forced to live on reserves, which most of the time the lands that were unsuitable for agriculture, hunting, and their traditional ways of life, thus leading them to heavily rely on government help and assistance. 2. It undermined Indigenous self-governance by imposing a colonial system of administration, including the imposition of band councils that often lacked legitimacy within their communities. 3. Indigenous peoples were not allowed to own or manage land outside of reserves, which limited their economic opportunities and autonomy. 4. The Indian Act created a discriminatory system of status that defined who was considered an Indian and who was not, which often resulted in the denial of indigenousness and rights and benefits to many Indigenous individuals. 5. Cultural erasure. The Indian Act banned Indigenous cultural practices such as potlatches, POW wows, and traditional ceremonies, breaking the transfer of traditional knowledge, values, and practices between generations. 6. Residential schools. Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and placed in residential schools where they faced physical, emotional, and sexual abuse and death. These schools assimilated Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian culture, leading to the loss of language, culture, and identity. 7. Loss of women's rights. Indigenous women who married non-Indigenous men lost their Indian status and were often excluded from their communities, while non-Indigenous women who married Indigenous men gained Indian status. 8. Economic marginalization. The Indian Act restricted Indigenous peoples' access to resources and economic opportunities, contributing to widespread poverty and unemployment in many Indigenous communities. 9. Intergenerational trauma. The impacts of the Indian Act, including residential schools and cultural erasure, have caused lasting intergenerational trauma that continues to affect Indigenous peoples today. 10. Ongoing discrimination. Although there have been amendments to the Indian Act over the years, it remains a source of ongoing discrimination against Indigenous peoples in Canada, perpetuating systemic racism and inequality. Let's dive a little deeper of what ongoing discrimination is. For example, the Indian Act has contributed to the negative stereotypes and prejudices against Indigenous peoples in Canadian society. These stereotypes can influence policy decisions, public opinion, and interactions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Indigenous peoples, particularly the youth, have poorer outcomes in education and high dropout rates and are significantly overrepresented in the Canadian criminal justice system. Indigenous children are disproportionately represented in the child welfare system. The legacy of residential schools and ongoing discrimination contribute to the high number of Indigenous children in foster care and the continued disruption of Indigenous families and communities. This is only the tip of the tippy, or the buffalo's horn, meaning we are just looking at the surface of the lasting effects of the Indian Act. What is the goal of societies, communities? Is it to have productive members contributing to the community? Wouldn't letting Indigenous people become that for themselves be for the betterment of everyone? Wouldn't everyone win? Will the government ever give up their hold on Indigenous peoples? Or the goal is and was always to conquer Indigenous peoples still? A great civilization is not conquered from without until it has destroyed itself within. Have they already destroyed themselves within? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Thank you for stopping by.